how you tax makes some difference. How much you tax makes some difference, but the biggest question is how much you spend. And California spends a lot, particularly if you look at the unfunded liabilities you have under your various government pension plans.
If you were going to give Governor Brown, if you were sitting here with Governor Brown and you were going to tell him you should do these three things, what would those three things be?
Well, he won't do these.
Okay.
Number one would be I would actually work towards the privatization of education.
Okay.
The California school system has failed by any kind of objective standards. You're pumping huge amounts of money into it and getting very poor outcomes. You can start with charter schools. In my own opinion, is what the goal ought to be is for-profit schools that create competition.
That's a controversial opinion.
It's a very controversial opinion, but it's coming anyway. I'll tell you why it's coming anyway. The revolution in technology is going to radically change the cost structure in education. It's maybe 10 years away, maybe 15 years away, and public schools will not innovate. And you're going to see radical reductions in cost and radical improvements in quality through experiments, through technology. And the outcome is going to be that the average student is going to become a much more effective critical thinker. What's killing middle-class kids, and people don't get this, is that today the value is not what it was a few years ago. Today is the ability to think critically. And public schools, not just in California, but across the country, are not teaching students how to be critical thinkers. And they're socializing kids, they're giving them a false kind of self-esteem, but they're not teaching them the rigor and demands of critical thinking and decision making. And the victims are really middle-class kids who can't go work in an automobile factory, as an example, anymore. Those things are going away. And we need innovation and creativity. We need competition.
Sure.
We need experiments. Markets are experiments. For every Google, there's 10,000 failed Googles. And that public schools don't experiment. They can't learn. They can't grow in that
And you think that private schools and charter schools are more accountable than public schools?
I don't think current private schools really are.
Okay.
I think you'd have to have real private schools in a sense of that you wouldn't have to compete against this massively subsidized entity. I mean, a parent that sends their kid to a private school is paying twice. And the teachers come from the same public universities. So private schools in general are probably a little bit better. Charter schools are better for poor kids. I mean, the evidence is whopping they're better for poor kids. But I
Sure.
see something much different than that. I see basically privatizing the public schools.
Okay.
Putting them up for sale.
So we know Governor Brown won't do that.
No, we're sure he won't do that.
So. Go ahead.
The second thing I would do would be roll back regulations, state-based regulations in California, which are often counterproductive, and a lot of times they sound good and you end up rolling them back anyway. A lot of the green stuff turns out it doesn't work, and you end up rolling it back. And the third thing, I cut taxes.
So you mentioned regulations. So there's you hear it more often than not from businesses and corporations in California that regulations are overburdening. And then at the flip side, someone who grew up in LA, some of the regulations have been quite positive, right? So our air is much cleaner than it was 10, 20, 30 years ago when I was a little kid. And so you wonder how do you strike the balance between an over-regulation environment like what we're seeing, or some people see in California, versus the right amount of regulation?
Well, I would argue that air pollution has been reduced by markets. I think if you look at the regulations, they were always behind the actual advances that were being made in technology. They couldn't ever get ahead of them, right? It's not possible. and consumers wanted cleaner cars. People, and they paid for that. Today, they select organic foods, right or wrong, but consumers are driving a better quality of environment. I think the regulations often actually get in the way, and I think in many cases they set lower goals than markets would demand. So I don't think California's cleaner because of regulations. I think California's cleaner because technological advances and consumers wanted a cleaner lifestyle, and they were willing to pay for it, and just like they buy organic food.
Sure. And then on taxation, what would be the ideal tax rate in California? No state income tax?
Well, I think there are major advantages to no state income tax. You can look at Texas and Florida,
Sure.
and actually what they do then, they keep sales taxes and gasoline taxes. Now you end up with the revenue stream, but what it does, it taxes consumption instead of investment, And the economics are it's much better to tax consumption rather than investment.
You know, one of the things California does well probably on a taxation level though is property taxes. We have some of the lower property taxes in the country, and compared to some of these no income tax states, they have high property taxes, which actually hurts retirees or people like my grandmother who are on a fixed income and couldn't afford the house if the taxes went up now that it's paid off. So, you know, do you see that as another one of those advantages for California, or do you see a need to change that as well?
The real big problem is California's total tax burden. I mean, the statistics are that how you tax makes some difference, how much you tax makes some difference, but the biggest question is how much you spend. And California spends a lot, particularly if you look at the unfunded liabilities you have under your various government pension plans and the potential cost in the long term. And when the governor says everything's fixed, well, that's not properly accounting for the liabilities. There's a whopping big hole there. So the real challenge is how do you cut government spending? So a property tax can be slightly better than an income tax if you look at the economics of it, but the question is how much you spend.
Sure.
What percentage of the economy goes to government, because government is less efficient than private enterprise.